Okay, how should Europe respond to Putin's aggression? Well, I would say, first of all, it's Europe's problem. Once again, not our problem.
Tough sanctions, though. Basically, that's true. It is long since time for us to pull the troops out of Europe. They've been there 67 years since World War II. They went in when Europe was poor and weak. Europe now is collectively able to defend itself, except the Europeans have figured out, the favorite book in Europe is Tom Sawyer, because they have persuaded us to paint their fence and act like they were doing us a favor for 67 years for billions of dollars.
Right.
But I do believe what the Russians are doing in Ukraine is awful. I think economic sanctions are legitimate, and what the Europeans ought to be doing is joining in sanctions and probably putting some troops in Lithuania, Latvia, other democratic nations before Putin moves to kind of deter.
In this video, the conversation turns sharply toward Russia's aggression in Ukraine, and Bill Maher wastes no time confronting former Congressman Barney Frank with a pointed question. Why is the United States still footing the bill for Europe's defense? With his usual blend of sarcasm and frustration, Maher highlights what he sees as a long-standing imbalance. Since World War II, American taxpayers have essentially been painting the fence of European security, while wealthy nations across the Atlantic have largely sidestepped the costs of building up their own militaries. Barney Frank, never one to back down, challenges Maher's framing. While he acknowledges the seriousness of Putin's invasion, he maintains that the primary responsibility to push back should fall on Europe. What followed was a sharp, passionate debate about military spending, economic sanctions, and the troubling reality that even after decades of pressure, many European nations still lean heavily on the United States as their security cushion. It was classic Maher, incisive, unapologetic, and unwilling to let political hypocrisy slide under the radar.
Pass a military reduction bill, and it's very disappointing to see even Rand Paul, who I thought was our big hero on this issue, now is reversing himself. Something his father would never do. I think backing more military spending.
They're misreading the American people. The American people, I think, agree with us. They don't want us sending ground troops back in. This kind of scare tactic that the terrorists are going to come and destroy the country, I think is wearing thin. And I believe if we keep pushing, that you can make the case. That's my book, is my theory about how you get back in to get people to like government. Stop wasting $100 billion a year unnecessarily on the military. Do it to help people go to school. Do it to build roads. Do it to things. And I think if the right candidate says that, the public wins.
And one of the reasons why Germany, among other nations, can spend so much more infrastructure on green energy is because they don't have to spend on the military. We cover their military.
We subsidize it.
Yeah, we basically subsidize it.
Japan also.
As well.
I want to be forgiving. I'm not always. 50 some odd, 62 years after World War II, I forgive Japan, I forgive Germany. They don't have to be disarmed. They don't have to rely on us. They can have their own weapons, and we can pull back.
From Maher's point of view, the discussion around Ukraine isn't just about foreign policy, it's a symptom of a much bigger problem: America's role as the world's default peacekeeper. He's been consistent in his criticism of what he calls the world police mentality, and in this case, he sees Europe as more than capable but unwilling to handle its own defense. To Maher, it's the same old story: American dollars, American troops, American sacrifices, while other wealthy nations watch from the sidelines. He brings historical weight to his argument. Since the end of World War II, the U.S. has maintained military bases, deployed troops, and spent billions to assure European stability. That made sense when the continent was recovering. But today, the European Union is a global economic force. Nations like Germany, France, and the UK are wealthy, politically stable, and perfectly equipped to manage their own defense. Maher finds it absurd that these countries still depend on the United States to lead the response to threats like Russia. If Putin is primarily a threat to Europe, then Europe should be leading the charge, diplomatically, economically, and militarily. Instead, Maher argues the U.S. continues to shoulder the burden while European nations benefit from America's involvement without fully contributing themselves. At the heart of his frustration lies a broader concern with America's spending priorities. Maher has long argued that the billions poured into global military operations could be better spent on domestic needs, like education, infrastructure, and healthcare. To him, the fact that America bankrolls European defense while many of those same countries offer robust social benefits to their citizens underscores what he sees as a fundamental absurdity in American policy. And Maher doesn't let U.S. politicians off the hook either. He calls out those who use international threats to justify ever-growing defense budgets, often at the expense of basic needs at home. Yes, he says, Putin is dangerous. But why must America always be the one to step in? Europe must take responsibility, because without accountability, the cycle will only repeat.
The rise of the anti-immigrant National Front Party in France, and should we be worried?
Maybe the death of, over a dozen Jews in France. I mean, and
cartoonists.
Well, Jews at the supermarket, and then the cartoonists at Charlie Hebdo.
Right.
I mean, that was a pretty significant event.
Yes.
In France, and that can spur some maybe anti-immigrant sentiment. And I think Marine Le Pen is maybe capitalizing on what is some very real fear for Jews in Paris and liberals in Paris.
I agree, but it's also, I think, because that exacerbated it. But I think it's the same situation we have, again, I'm quoting my book, but we have this problem with working people who have not had a chance to participate in the prosperity that comes forward, because the economies in developed Western worlds have tilted in favor of people with high-end skills. So the people who 40 years ago could go to work in a factory and make a decent living, they have problems doing that. And I believe economic dissatisfaction is a large part of the Tea Party, and it's a large part of what's going on there. Yes, there is an element.
Please don't equate those two. Please don't do that. I don't think you want to make that mistake.
I didn't equate them. I said it's a large.
And ISIS.
I wasn't talking about ISIS. No, I'm talking about the Tea Party and the French right. That's the equation. The dissatisfaction that's leading people to be so angry is I think, at root economic. And again, I'll go back. That's why I want to pull back $100 billion that we're wasting. I think I want to be the strongest nation in the world. But we don't have to be quite as strong as we are. And if we use that money to deal with economic problems at home, it would be good in itself and would alleviate a.
Shifting gears, Maher turns his focus to the rise of the far-right National Front in France, a movement he sees as both predictable and dangerous. It's fueled by a potent mix of economic anxiety, cultural division, and fears about national security. But in Maher's eyes, this isn't just a French issue, it's part of a much broader global trend. All over the Western world, working-class voters are drifting toward nationalist, populist movements that promise simple solutions to deeply complex challenges. Maher, never afraid to tackle uncomfortable truths, sees this as a collision between two competing worldviews. Europe for decades has celebrated its liberal values, openness, tolerance, and inclusivity. But now many citizens feel those ideals have come at a cost: economic strain, rapid cultural change, and an erosion of traditional national identity. Incidents like the Charlie Hebdo shooting and the attack on a Jewish supermarket weren't just tragic, they marked turning points in the public's psyche. Suddenly, many in France began to question whether their commitment to open borders and progressive values had left them vulnerable. But Maher doesn't stop at security.